everyone. Thanks for attending this moderated discussion on the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network. Recent research by Norad et al. Published in the Journal of Rural Mental Health shows that farmer suicides increased from 2003 to 2017. Well, this is evidence for centering farm stress in policy because it demonstrates an ongoing and unfolding crisis, and also centering farm stress in scholarship and programming. It follows a lull in emphasis on mental health that had surged during and following the 1980s farm crisis. Then crisis lines, farm aid, and other social forms were constructed to support farmers. They provided tools that are being leveraged now, and new ones are being created. Yet the underlying conditions that drove the crisis then remain. Today, our moderated discussion, led by Dr. Mary Hendrickson, a senior scholar and rural sociologist in analyzing the agriculture sector, will discuss with Dr. Heather Sedges, who is the principal investigator for the Southern Ag Exchange Network, and Dr. Jack Whippler, the principal investigator for Cultivemos, on how they have worked on the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Networks. Our goal is to offer a venue where they can lay out their current work, the stressors farmers confront, how they build partnerships, the interventions they focus on, and how they see this work progressing. Along the way, we will make historical connections and embed the discussions in larger dynamics around agriculture's economic and policy structures. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A tool. Time permitting, I will ask the moderator and discussants these questions. Now, I turn the discussion over to our moderator and discussants.
Great, thank you, Andy. And I'm really excited to be here today. It's a little bit of deja vu given my advisor, Dr. Bill Heffernan, and his wife, Judy Heffernan, were instrumental in providing, getting some of the funding early on in the 1980s farm crisis. But today I want to ask if you could, Jack and Heather, if you could give us some background for everybody here talking to make sure that they know what the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Networks really are. So what you see as the goals of this program, and then kind of how your organizations kind of are advocating for and working with these fund opportunities. Either one of you can go first. Jack, you're it.
This is Jack. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And just, grateful. Just want to start with grateful for being here, and did not realize everyone was in the room. So thanks for listening to us chat away. Very comfortable space for us. So my understanding of how the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network, the FRSAN funding, the goals of it from the USDA perspective are kind of four main things: is to create a network of ag service, well, I should say broadly, create a network of ag service providers who are better equipped to be supporting farmers, ranchers, and farm workers in their mental health and the stress that they're experiencing day in and day out. The four main objectives that USDA has tasked to each of the four regions receiving these funds is to, 1, create a network, 2, be sharing resources, 3, to have trainings, and 4, to have a hotline or helpline that farmers, ranchers, farm workers themselves can be calling into in moments of need, whether that be more directly related to receiving content-related resources, such as I'm having this issue on my land with a neighbor, what might be legal supports, or to be more of a crisis hotline that is more related to acute mental health crises. So that's some of the broad pictures around the goals of the funding. I can share a little bit more about how my organization, National Young Farmers Coalition, came to this work in the Northeast, but I'll pause quickly, Heather, to see if there's anything else that you want to add first.
You know that there's always an excitement for me to talk. However, I would like to hear you continue, and then I can switch over.
This is Jack. Thanks, Heather. So for my organization, National Young Farmers Coalition, a little background: we are a national organization who advocate for new and beginning farmers. Historically, that's been more around age, but as we get bigger, recognizing that there are young farmers who are beginning farmers of any age, so new and beginning farmers. And our organization a core model to it is chapters of young farmers across the country who can organize at a local, state, regional level and advocate for their needs and policies. So for my organization, our work around farmer mental health came out of organizing in Washington State. One of the Washington State chapter organizers died by suicide in May of 2017. Of the Young Farmers chapter, and that Young Farmers chapter in Washington State then went on to advocate at the state level for increased support in Washington for farmer mental health. And then that got picked up with young farmers at the national level, recognizing that this is not an issue that is unique to young farmers. It's not an issue that is unique to Washington State and really needs to have nationwide support and specific funding for it. So I think that's mentionable as well, is that previous farm bills have had mentions around the importance of farmer mental health, but the 2018 Farm Bill is the first time that there was any specific money allocated to farmer mental health in the form of the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network.
Heather, I'll let you chime in now.
All right. Well, one of my favorite things about this funding stream from USDA NIFA is that it is regional, which allows us to kind of try out a couple of different ways of implementing and implementing our work and attaining those 4 core deliverables that Jack mentioned earlier. And so we share those same goals around resources and network connections and hotlines and all of that. And how we're doing that in the southern region is we center ourselves around a few key initiatives, and then we pull partners in that have particular expertise in a slice of that. And that kind of goes to some of the other questions that are going to be posed in a little while. So I'll pause on going any further than that. But we function in a way what we call our action teams. And each action team is devoted to a specific component of the deliverables, but also recognizing the need for capacity building and infrastructure when creating a network, even before we're able to start marching towards some of those deliverables. So, you know, it's wonderful to say we're going to work with communities on the ground. We're going to do all this great work. However, you can't just show up. You've got to build a relationship. And that is one of the benefits that Jack's group had going into this work. They had some really nice established relationships with members of the community they serve and the audiences. So that is also what we are doing here in the southern region.
Heather, can you say just a little bit more about what you mean by capacity building?
Absolutely. So let me give an example. For a number of medical and mental health practitioners out there, particularly in rural areas, we already know that there's a lack of availability for services. We know that. On top of that, that's further compounded when addressing farm stress in particular, because the issues surrounding farmers' unique needs when it comes to farm stress, that it is a 24/7 occupation, that it has unpredictable components that remove a person's sense of control and agency. And so finding practitioners that understand those nuances in agriculture is very difficult. So in order to build capacity, one of the things that we are doing is we're identifying those trusted practitioners in the field. And if they don't have a background in agriculture or understand the cultural context of agrarian life, then we work to educate about that. That's one tiny example, but that's what I'll leave you with.
So it's really interesting to hear about these things. I'm actually a child of the farm crisis of the 1980s. And so I went to college in that time period. Surprisingly, my parents managed to make it available to me. But I remember there were a lot of stressors going on then. And so I'm really interested in what you're finding are the stressors that farmers and ranchers are reporting, on the farm, but also in the larger society in terms of policy changes, economic structures, things like that. So what are you hearing?
I'll kick it off and then I'll bounce it back to Jack to fill in. So in the southern region in particular, we conducted a series of focus groups, and there's been quite a bit of research leading up to all of this. And I think Dr. Smolsky referenced Dr. Norad's article in the introduction that really helps unpack some of the need to study this. So while continued and more perhaps commodity specific or cross audience comparisons may need to be made in the literature, we do know a couple of core pieces of what the stressors are for farmers. And these are, let me be very clear in how I talk about these stressors are the root causes. So I want people to think about directionality here of concerns. It is not that you go into farming and then all of a sudden you have a mental health diagnosis. That's not it. The reality is that farmers are problem solvers, they're resilient, they're strong. But what's happening is that they are having a combination of stress. It's both chronic stress, so that day to day, I can't take a vacation if I'm a dairy farmer, no one else can do this work. In addition to episodic stressors, so maybe a derecho comes through the plains and knocks out your crops, or maybe there's a drought or a flood or what have you. That would be an isolated stressor, but just put that on top of the everyday stuff, what we call pileup, and it's what exhausts people and really brings them to the point of crisis. So for us, the core stressors, we have 7. Let's see if I can do this. Ready? So weather, surprise, weather, finances, labor, health and safety, legal issues. That's 6. Andy, what am I forgetting? I've tried to make an acronym out of this. I know Emily's on the back end over here, just absolutely screaming at me.
Mental health.
Mental health. So we have like safety, and then we also have just the stress and the management of it. Thank you, Emily. So that's weather, finances, labor, health, physical health and safety, and then also their stress and mental health. Emily for the win. I'll pass it over to Jack.
This is Jack. Thank you, Heather. And Mary, thanks for this question. I appreciate, Heather, you starting with, really framing it as like root causes, because so often, at least for myself, when I'm reading about farmer mental health in popular press, it can really take on a flashpoint approach and looking at, here is this devastating suicide that's happened in the community, for example, and those are so important and devastating and just the tips of the iceberg, and don't necessarily then dive into how did we get here. And Heather, I think you spoke very, very well to both these episodic and these chronic stressor moments. What we have been finding in the Northeast is very similar to the list of 7 that you went through, Heather, so I won't fully repeat. But we had, similarly to the focus groups, we conducted listening sessions in our first year, and we've been subsequently conducting listening sessions and really tried to focus on groups of farmers who are not adequately captured in many data sets, and sometimes aren't even recognized as farmers in data sets because of the size of their holdings, because of their various identities and positionalities to farming. So for example, the USDA Census of Agriculture focuses on owners and operators, but not the other over 2 million folks in the ag system who identify as farm workers. So when we've been approaching these questions around farm stress, really trying to look at groups of farmers, again, that might not be captured. So in our listening sessions, we talk to farm workers, young farmers who may be owning farms, but often are farm workers themselves, folks who are recent arrivals, new arrival farmers, Somali Bantu farmers, Jewish farmers, queer farmers, for example, and found that some of the broad themes were, again, related to financials, work conditions, farming conditions, livelihood, and economic. But to dive into those a little bit more, again, trying to shift this perspective from just solely the perspective of the farm owner and farm worker, from the farm owner and operator to the farm worker. Many of those issues from the farm worker perspective had to do with low wages, insufficient work crews, and the amount of stress that comes from being one of not many doing this work, burnout while being involved in farm work, racial issues as a farm worker, and often having owners and operators who are white. And if you are a BIPOC or non-English speaker, or various different levels of privilege and access that helps you advocate or not for yourself, such as, do you have documentation? Also talked about lack of health insurance, lack of housing stability. A lot of people who work on farms are food insecure themselves, and the amount of stress that that can bring. So those were some things that came up in our farmer listening sessions. Also want to note that for, again, the organization that I work for, National Young Farmers Coalition, we conducted a survey last year leading up to the Farm Bill to really get a sense of what are the major challenges for young farmers. So for farmers who are 40 and under, the main points that came up there were access to land, access to capital, healthcare costs, cost of production, housing, and student loan debt. So when we're thinking about farmer mental health, it can be a really big issue that we're not just saying, here's a voucher, hope you can talk to a therapist, good luck. That approach alone is insufficient to addressing all of these root causes that lead to the stressors, the daily grind that we are seeing in the ag community.
Go ahead, Andy.
I just two quick thoughts had come up in the discussion that Heather and Jack were saying. One was when Heather mentioned legal, and one of the things we focus on here in the southern region, and I know is actually more widespread throughout the country, is heirs property. And it's how these things are also compounding, because heirs property is a stressor, yes, is a legal stressor, but then it's also a financial stressor, and it's also a familial stressor, because it really does mean interfamilial conflict over control of land, and how that can then amplify a whole host of challenges for a farmer. And then Jack had mentioned burnout, and one of the things that Dr. Schulman and myself have been focusing on with niche meat farmers is the role of diversification. And diversification is talked a lot about as kind of a livelihood strategy. But farmers we were interviewing were also talking about becoming over diversified, or being pushed to some very real limits in terms of their time and energy and capacity to manage so many different tasks. And so I wonder too, and maybe this is something that the panelists can talk about later, but like at what point also do things that we're putting forward as solutions also become drivers of stress in and of themselves, just because of the overall structure of agriculture? So yeah, that part of my interruption.
Can I add just one quick little citation in here too? I want to mention that we're talking about these root causes of stressors. It's a really great article written. It's in the Journal of Rural Studies. It was published in January of 2023 by Heberlin and Shatuk. I'm probably butchering those names.
Yep.
Not what I want to do, but they talk about how the current paradigm of thinking about mental health does not get to those root causes. And that's really an important piece of this conversation.
Well, and I think that there's so many societal wide kinds of things that then impact farmers and farm workers and ranchers in, in particular ways. And I'm thinking about the drought last year we had in Missouri that was really, variegated. But like Kansas looks like the entire state is in terrible shape right now in terms of weather. But then you add on there like student loan debt and healthcare issues, and these are, huge societal issues that are very context specific for agriculture. So I think it's really important kinds of work. So, like, what are you guys doing in these networks? You mentioned earlier, Heather, about capacity building and so on, but who are your partners? What are you, which kind of partners are you seeking out and kind of why? And then how are you doing that networking and collaboration to really help address the stress issues?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So first of all, I'm going to answer the why first. So the reason why we connect and collaborate with key partners is because, first of all, we can't do it all, right? Nor should we do it all. I don't think one single source of a type of intervention or a fact sheet or what have you is going to get to the root causes of all farmers, farm workers, farm families, and all of those proximal to agrarian life. So what's really important is that we participate in shared responsibility for bringing resources to fruition with people who hold the cultural nuance, the specific knowledge and expertise, not only of the content, commodity, issue, but also deeply understanding the culture, the cultural context of each group. So to that end, in the southern region, we've partnered both with groups and organizations that help us have a broad reach, because that capacity piece is important to us. But we also have strategically thought through who are the gatekeepers to farmers, who not in a negative way, but who has trust capital is maybe how I want to say that. So who's trusted amongst those groups and who has the knowledge. So in working to identify all of that, so infrastructure-wise, we tend to partner with our land grant universities, respecting the fact that the land that they are on was cultivated many, many years ago by people far before us, right? And so understanding the historical nuances of that land and its use is really, really important to us in the southern region. So we partner with land grant universities, cooperative extension, all of those groups, but we are also specifically focusing on engaging and building groups that do hold that cultural context, such as our 1890s or HBCU partners. And then there's a number of nonprofits that we work with, specifically RAFI or Rafi, depending which accent you prefer. And that's the Rural Advancement Fund and International. And so we work directly with them. We work, interestingly, a little bit outside of our region, and we partnered with the Iowa Rural Concern Line. And so they're helping us build our capacity for a hotline. We also are working with Farm Aid in collaboration there. And then a number of other groups like Operation Spring Plant, for instance, in North Carolina there. A wonderful group of people that you want to talk trust capital and have walked the walk, that's where it's at. So finding those areas and the partners that match not only our needs, but the needs, most importantly, of farmers. North Carolina agrimedicine is a great example here. So really unpacking that, but always working in a manner that facilitates partnership. And the root of that for us is transparent, open, honest conversations that can sometimes take a little bit of courage.
Jack, what about in your case?
This is Jack. Oh, I'm so grateful for a chance to talk about partners and say that with a lot of humbleness in that I was not a part of grant writing for this project. I was hired on once these funds were received, and just really appreciate all the leadership and intention that the 4 parents of this grant had to set up the grant in this way. So I'm on the Northeast region. We refer to ourselves as cultivemos, which is in Spanish to cultivate, but a conjugation that's really let's cultivate together. So really want to say that in talking about partners, some of whom are on this call, in that the way that this grant was written was with 6 partnerships in mind. Young Farmers is the main recipient on paper, and we are responsible for a lot of the back end reporting, financials, but it's a shared leadership model where we are working, the 6 of us together, with its Farm Aid, hi Farm Aid on the call, Farm First, which is an organization in Vermont. I go alphabetically, Migrant Clinicians Network, who is national and has some strong representation in Maryland, Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, who is NEFOC, University of Maine Cooperative Extension, and then us, National Farmers, Young Farmers. And those 6 partnerships, some of them had existed previously from a 1-year version of this pilot grant. And then in moving to the 3-year application, those who wrote the grant really wanted to shift and uplift the diversity of folks who are in agriculture and really hold racial equity as a core value. And again, echoing Heather around the importance of trust, knowledge, and making sure that if we are wanting to focus on farm workers, for examples, and racial equity, those partners need to be the leaders of that work. So that is in the 3-year grant, the partnership specifically with Migrant Clinicians Network and NEFOC to lead those parts of the project and those partnerships. And I should say, as we have been working in this grant, the grant is written to be directed towards ag service providers and to be then serving farmers and farm workers. And on the ground, a little bit of self-reflection, it's a little bit messy in that we are talking about farmers and farm workers and ranchers. However, it's a room full of ag service providers. So we are working to not only live our network's value of being farmer and farm worker informed, but really try to shift that power and recognize, if you look at data set after data set and ask farmers and farm workers, who do you go to in moments of stress? Their answers often are not first and foremost ag service providers. It is each other. Those are the trusted individuals. Those are the people who are closest, who are most able to respond and be there in moments of small and little crises. So we also have a farmer advisory board that's made up of 10 individuals across this region, and something that we're really have failed in many ways and are still trying to live up to its full potential, and uplift farmers and farm workers as ag service providers themselves, especially when it comes to farmer mental health, that they are the leaders, they are the trusted individuals in the communities, they are the ones with the knowledge. I've said a lot, but a little bit more on model, Mary, is so we have the leadership around those 6 organizations and the farmer advisory board. We're very value driven. The 2 key values that I really keep trying to hone in on are racial equity and being farmer and farm worker informed. And the pathways that we take to collaboration, I think about being hubs and spokes, that we have this hub of leadership and then have groups of ag service providers and farmers who have come together based upon shared interest, shared identity, shared geography, who are on the ground and have identified what are the issues that they're seeing in their communities, and are then given the opportunity to address those in the ways that feels most relevant, efficient, effective, culturally appropriate to them and for them. NEFOC often reminds all of us that their model is a for us by us approach when they are a BIPOC organization doing programming for BIPOC farmers, and really try to take that and live that across the network, that we want people themselves to be determining what is needed and to be giving that leadership to themselves and to make this power shift not only within our organization, but also in the way that access to funds and granting happens. FRSAN is a very large pot of funds. Over these 3 years, it's $7.2 million. And you have to be a large organization to receive that. So as much as possible, really trying to get funds into these rivers and tributaries across the ag scene, rather than just one Mississippi River of funding from USDA to one entity, for example. So that's a little bit of our partnerships and how we work. And I'm sure in later questions, I can dive a little bit more into what that looks like on the ground.
Well, that's I think that's really interesting. We're hearing a lot more calls, like just your last comment about making sure that the money gets out into these places where people can really use it, right? And sometimes agencies and universities don't really know the complicated realities on the ground. And I really appreciate you bringing that up. I know that Judy Heffernan, we've been trying to do a little bit of work hearing people's voices from the 1980s farm crisis. And she was telling me how churches, what should have been one of the trusted institutions for a lot of Midwestern farmers, kind of were closed about this, and people didn't want to talk to people in the church or pastors or something about this, and really felt like churches had failed them, in the process. These are people that actually lost their farms. So in the process of that. So I think that this is really important to mention the messiness and how you start to really try to use these kinds of resources in really beneficial ways. And that kind of leads me a little bit to the next question, because I keep hearing some echoes of the of past farm crises, but they're different, right? It's different today because I think that there's a lot more acceptance of discussing mental health issues today versus in past times. But a lot of the things that were set up during the 1980s, like hotlines, like programs and so on, or were set up to kind of address some of the issues that were identified in that farm crisis. I'm curious what kind of parallels you're kind of drawing from that historical era. How is it different? How is it the same? What's echoing here? Because, I get pretty nervous right now. I see interest rates. Specific policy choices about interest rates in particular are really problematic for a lot of our farmers, just like they were in the 1980s. A specific policy choice really just changed their financial outlook like immediately. So what are some of those kinds of echoes and some of the changes that you see that are different today that kind of drive the crisis that we're seeing?
Jack, did you go ahead?
I was going to say, I can't speak a ton to the echo, so I'm happy to take a first short and sweet swing, Heather. And if you want to jump in a little bit more, one of the things that I'm really seeing in this moment is the impact of COVID-19. And when COVID-19 hit hard, it really shed light on the vulnerability of food systems. And many consumers really, I think, not for the first time, but thought a little bit deeper about where their food was coming from, but not necessarily who those people are who are growing and raising that food, what it means to be a frontline worker. So the first thing that comes to mind right now in this moment is there's so much that's going on in the world, but really that impact of COVID-19 opening the door to the precarity and insecurity of food systems, and particularly global supply chains. And some of the other big major things that I'm thinking about are, immigration policies, exceptionalism to health and employment protections that does not cover ag communities. And to me, a lot of those things really at their core come back to racism and xenophobia, which, Andy, you alluding to earlier, some of the baseline issues with current contemporary ag systems, but those aren't new isms in agriculture. This is an agriculture system that has been based on colonization and genocide and slavery. So these are very, very deep rooted and not at all new. However, we have moments where maybe it's a little bit clearer for people and able to see it. But of course, climate change right now as well, global supply chains, as I mentioned. So think there's just a lot in this moment that is causing stress and can open people's eyes to what it is like as someone in agriculture in this moment. But Heather, I can bounce to you. This is my version of short and sweet.
That was amazing. This is why in the beginning, I don't mind being Jack. So I really love that you unpacked the changes at the global scale level that really were not as ubiquitous in the 1980s as truly they are now. And so, and the supply chain issue is a big deal. Think about accessing potash in your fertilizer because of a war happening in Russia and Ukraine. I mean, there are direct effects. However, one of the things that through line, the echoes that we were talking about, you know, I tell a lot of stories, so I'm going to tell a quick little anecdote here. I was, as a studious researcher and university professor, I was online doing all of my literature review and everything. And I came across a great article. I was like, oh, this article is perfect. It outlines those 7 stressors. It's talking about all these things. It was wonderful. I was like, this is the golden unicorn of all articles. It was published in 1988.
Yep.
And so what I have to say is that the issues we're facing are pernicious. They are insidious. They require a systems level change, not only fact sheets, intervention programs, or even capacity building. They require some overhaul of how we're thinking about things. So, so to that end, we hear the echoes of the past. I also think it has influenced a bit of reservation around accepting support and assistance from governmental programs, because in the 1980s, the impetus of so much was a policy change. So why would we want to trust that, right? And so we have to really think about the, for lack of a better term, the historical trauma on the issue. But Dr. Hendrickson, you mentioned that you were a child of the farm crisis. So I'm kind of curious about your perspective on this as well.
Well, I still have family that farms, but it was not easy. My brother came back to be a farmer, and promptly after 2.5 years on the farm, and he came back in 1981. You know, it was a cohort issue too. So he was just slightly younger than the cohort that really got slammed. But you know, we had the geopolitics of the grain embargo happening in the 1979, 1980. Then you had the specific policy choices about the change in interest rates. And I know at one point we went from having all of us kids working on the farm, my brother working full-time with my dad and my parents, to my parents working, and all of the rest of us having off-farm jobs and then trying to deal with it. And it was very difficult, but we were also fortunate not to be as leveraged, so we didn't have as many problems. But still, it was really, there's not very many people in my class that came back to farm, and I grew up in a farming community in Nebraska. And so, this has impacts on the community, right? Has, people leave, find other opportunities. We all like to go back, but we're not there. And so that really has impacts on what the community looks like too. And I think that I really appreciate, Heather, what you brought up about the systems issues. Loka Ashwood at the University of Kentucky and I are doing some, we're just kind of fell into it, but are trying to capture some of these people that were working early on in that farm crisis and collecting information. And I'd heard about these things from my advisor and from others, from Dr. Paul Leslie at Iowa State, folks, but to have it to bring it out again and to talk about how, how Bill and Judy went out to these to these church halls and all these places all across Missouri and, have lines form after their presentation, just people wanting to talk because there wasn't any access to resources, right? And they gave a presentation that people could relate to. So I think we're further ahead this time around, I'm hoping. But we also, and that kind of leads me to this next question. What are the interventions that, given that these are some pretty large systemic issues, right? That then become crystallized in individual families and with individuals in terms of mental health issues, how can we support some kind of collective responses? And that's why I was so interested that you both emphasized the network. And Jack, I think you were talking too about the NEFOC leading that, that idea that we're all in this together. I think that really resonated with me. So what are we gonna do? I guess what kinds of interventions can we have to create a perhaps more resilient agrarian community? And I hesitate a little bit to use that word resilient because when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about social and community level resilience, ecological resilience, but sometimes people use it about individuals. Oh, they're very resilient. So, what are we going to do? Either of you. Other.
Well, I will respond, but I will preface it with this. I don't have the singular answer, and there, spoiler alert, there is not one singular answer. These solutions are as big and as messy as the root causes of them are. So, I said that these issues are pernicious, they're longitudinal, they're insidious. So the interventions kind of have to be the same. However, I think it's important to think about solutions and interventions as an array of options because there are so many points at which farmers, producers, farm workers are experiencing stress. So if we think about those 7 root causes, weather is one of them. So when we talk about climate change, nobody cares more about climate change than farmers. I really am hard pressed to find people that get it more than they do. And so, what are we doing to make ourselves aware of changes in climate trends and how to respond effectively? As far as loans and accessing financial resources to serve as to be nimble with your operation, changing some of the parameters around who qualifies, what the qualifications are, accessing those qualifications, all of those. So really going back to some of the identifying those key barriers to things. However, it also needs a community level approach where we're educating people who are proximal to farmers. So you mentioned earlier about the churches, or faith organizations, faith places to address this. So a big part of this is to not look away or shy away from awareness and knowledge building exercises, because with knowledge and education comes power, and it opens up the conversation. We worked on another project moons ago about addressing obesity in rural America. And in doing so, we actually partnered with our faith institutions in rural communities, and they started calling it out. And it was wonderful. People locked into it because let me remind everyone that's listening and watching today, just because you mention mental health or stress or even suicide, it is not going to cause someone to become stressed or have a mental health diagnosis or attempt suicide. Because if we were really that powerful, if we just said something and then other people did it, my goodness, my name would be Dr. Jack Beutler, and I could just make that change right away, right? But it is not. And so we can't just tell people about something or talk about it and they change. So the inverse of that for negative behaviors or negative consequences is true. So opening these conversations is really an important first step. And then making sure those resources are out there for people to access. And here's where the Southern region really focuses. We are laser focused on ensuring the effective and efficient access to those resources. So we see our role as serving as a conduit to options that would address those root causes of stress. So, and we will be doing that through, a comprehensive resource database, an online portal where people will be able to connect with one another, but in ways that resonate with farmers, producers, and farm workers, and that allows for that nuance. We do know that social support is one of the most protective factors. And so really building those communities that are out there will be really important. And before I close out this part of my response, I also wanted to just harken back to the previous one and add in one additional little difference here. Maybe not so much of a difference from the 80s to now, but land prices and urban sprawl are happening at such a rapid rate in rural America that for some generations, when the farm changes hands, it's enticing to listen to builders coming in and offering thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars per acre. And maybe that's the solution for people, and they're thinking in that way. But if we continue in that manner, most of our farms in this country, over 95%, are run as family farms. So it's really important to keep that in mind.
Thanks. Jack?
This is Jack. Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Heather. Mary, I appreciate you starting with, the note on resilience, because when I think about farmer mental health, particularly as a sociologist, I think about this as a question of agricultural viability, of agricultural sustainability, and that goes from the soil level to the societal level. Like, we need to be considering that entire breadth and band. And to echo you, Heather, there is no single solution, nor is this an individual's responsibility to solve in themselves and of themselves. So how can we look at the structural societal level? And I don't have answers, but I can tell you about what we're doing in the Northeast with the big cushion of, this is a very new program. We are less than 3 years into this. We are a toddler, and there's so much learning that is happening, and false steps and not living up to values. So again, always want to share with lots of transparency and being humble that we're trying, and in some of that, it messes things up more, and dedicated to continuing to grow and to try and to be present in this landscape. So in the Northeast, again, cultivemos, we have, I guess the first thing to touch on is just like, if anyone in this call is trying to think about what is the right now thing that I could be able to direct a farmer to, or a farm worker, in those main things that the USDA has tasked with us, we have resources. So Farm Aid is our partner on resources. They have a farmer resource network. That's a really extensive search tool where you can go on and say, I am a farmer in North Carolina looking for support on financials. And there's a wonderful list of resources that get populated by the Farm Aid team, who spends a lot of time combing through and making sure that that is available. That farmer resource network is available in both Spanish and in English. Additionally, Farm Aid is our partner for the hotline. And this is a hotline where you can call in We have extended hours now because of this funding. So I believe it's from 9 a.m. Eastern to 10 p.m. Pacific, or to 10 p.m. because we have Pacific coverage too. Don't quote me on that, but a really, really long time of day where you can call in and say, again, I'm a farm worker who is struggling with this type of issue. What's available to me? And the amazing Farm Aid hotline staff members are able to help you comb through, give referrals, and help you with next steps. So I want to share those two as like top of the line resources around how to gain help in the ag community if there is something going on. Diving a little bit deeper into like what is the overall model that we're using that I've spoken a little bit to around this hub and spokes approach is that with Cultivamos, our kind of three-prong approach is addressing root causes that we've talked a lot about today, but recognizing that, again, simply having vouchers does not address what is leading to the bubbling up of a stressful moment. So addressing root causes that might range from climate change to racial discrimination, for example. In focusing on root causes, we are prioritizing the communities who have been disproportionately impacted and harmed by those root causes. So we're focusing on young farmers, farm workers, as well as farmers who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and focusing our efforts on those three communities broadly, and aiming to have the biggest impact through regranting. So again, I spoke about this a little bit, but rather than just me sitting here as the PD of this fund and saying, you need this and you need that and you need that, to say, let's have groups of farmers and ag service providers come together, determine themselves what is most useful and beneficial for their communities, and go out and conduct that project and to provide those funds to do so. So our approach there can really range from things that are a little bit more direct mental health related. So we have groups of farmers and ag service providers who are working on mental health trainings, who have created a magazine in Spanish that focuses specifically on Latinx farmer and farm worker mental health in totality, first ever of its kind. A group of farmers who are making a resource guide for Black farmers who may be navigating the landscape of farmer mental health. So that's kind of more on like the direct mental health side that these groups have determined for themselves. On more of the structural side, we have groups that are focusing on land access, especially land access for BIPOC folks, PFAS contamination. We have a group in Maine that's been trying to get early testing and awareness for farms that are affected by PFAS. And also emerging approach around collective and community care. So we have groups of queer ag service providers who have done granting out to queer and trans BIPOC collectives to fulfill their own mental health needs, and also have groups of queer farmers who are doing queer farmer skill shares. So again, really recognizing the approach that I mentioned earlier, that when farmers are looking for help, they're often going to each other. So particularly if you are a farmer who has been historically and contemporarily marginalized and are at the intersections of various oppressions, your trusted individuals are more likely to be other queer farmers, for example, than going to an ag service provider. Yes, so that's kind of the approach that we run through in the Northeast. And again, root causes, focus on vulnerable communities, and this regranting approach, really trying to lean into self-determination and autonomy and greater access to funds.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I think that we might be leading right now into wrap up. I still had a couple of questions, but I think it's been really an interesting discussion that I've really enjoyed. And what I kind of hear, while I totally agree there's no one solution, I'm kind of hearing that what we're talking about is trying to make the spaces and build the capacity for people just to be kind of in communion with people, right? And that is really the first step of like this collective response. So I really think what you're talking about, Jack, what you were just talking about with the regranting and really pushing that out. To me, that's kind of a really nice way of thinking about the capacity building, right? Sometimes it just takes a little bit of resources to really help people find ways to, to create some collective response together. So, and I've always been such a big fan of the National Young Farmers Coalition idea of those chapters. I know that our chapter here in Missouri does these, just dinners, like there's no pressure dinner, right? Like potluck dinners. And those things they don't sound like much, but I think that those start to become really important. I see, Heather, you wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, I'm going to burst out of my skin because the University of Kentucky does a great job with this. They just rehauled an evidence-based program, Farmer Dinner Theater. We're calling it Barn now, and there'll be training coming up soon, so we can get some information up about that. But they do a really nice job of bringing people together around these kinds of, and facilitating those conversations. And just one last thing, something that we're really focused on in the southern region is in terms of building capacity for people to use information to make change. One thing that we're marching towards and requires quite a bit of groundwork, but is really GIS mapping of where are the needs and where are the resources. Because I think what is so powerful, we can sit here and talk about this issue all day long, but what is so powerful is to be able to show, hey, this producer cannot get to market because look at the literal distance between this. And so being able to provide objective, quantifiable, visual data to people is something that we're actually very actively working on right now, and we're excited about it.
Great. Well, I'm going to turn it back over to Andy because I know he's our timekeeper here, but I really appreciated the conversation, and thank you both, Dr. Weibler and Dr. Sedges.
I'm actually really kind of sad that there's a time limit on this thing because I want to know what Dr. Hendrickson's questions are. And to just hear more about what y'all are discussing, around support networks, around the last shall be first kind of collective strategy that Dr. Whippler is putting on the table. Really reminds me of the liberation theology concepts that came out of Latin America during the 70s and 80s. So really just a lot of interesting stuff that's being discussed here around this topic of farm and farm worker stress. And I really just feel very appreciative for y'all's time today. And I don't know if, y'all have any last minute comments. I know, and Jack, you could kick it off because you'll have to leave us first, but if you have any last minute comments from each of y'all.
This is Jack. Yes, I'm popping over to another USDA panel on LGBTQ mental health and agriculture. So hopefully we'll see some of you there, but just want to say so much gratitude, Andy, Mary, and Heather for sharing the space together and just really uplift the collective response, the focus on equity, and hoping in the future to really do this power shift of not just simply being informed by farmers and farm workers, but to have this be a movement that is farmer and farm worker led with lots of autonomy and trust around it, with equity always at the center. So thank you so much. I am going to slide away. So I know you might close up with some final comments, but thank you everyone. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Jack. Have a good one. Heather?
Well, goodbye to Jack, who's doing such great work. I just want to echo the gratitude for this opportunity to share. I would, in my little nerd brain, this is the stuff that makes my my spidey sense tingle. I love talking about all of this, but what I love even more is collaborating with people that make it happen. And so to that end, I just want to recognize our SAGE, that's our Southern Region moniker, but I just want to recognize our leadership team and the impressive work that they are doing to really get everything going. And what they do is make sure that they're thinking about farmers first. And I just really admire our team and our partners for doing all that. So I am so grateful for this opportunity, Dr. Hendrickson. You may or may not see me on your doorstep tomorrow because I would love to continue this conversation. But so thank you so much.
I really appreciated being here. Thank you, Andy, for inviting me and to be part of this. I just really think it's so important to link the past and present, because there are, it's obviously not the same, but there might be strategies, and there's things that we heard in the 1980s that make sense now, right? And things that don't. So I really like this idea of trying to link the past and present. And I really appreciated, Heather, what you said about the article that was just correct, or just so on. And I was like, oh yeah, the same kinds of things that are happening. So.
Yeah. I was wondering why it was a little grainy on the printout and why it looked like typewriter type, but alas. And
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much. And I guess that unfortunately wraps it up, right, Dr. Smolsky?
I think it does, but be on the lookout, because considering, Mary, what you're saying, I think that we need to organize that future conversation. What you're saying makes me think of that kind of cliche line nowadays: first is tragedy, then is farce. And I worry that we might be in the more farcical situation where we know a lot more about what we should be doing, but yet we're still not addressing it. And so learning from the past can really help us to move forward in ways that don't have us tripping over the same obstacles over and over again. Or like my mentor, Dr. Schulman, says, living deja vu. Yeah. So thank you all so much for your time today. And everybody, thank you all for being here and joining us. I'll get this recording up and out to folks in the future. And we look forward to y'all attending other webinars we have. And have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.